Greetings, Professor McKee here with our next video for our seminar Saturdays. And today's paper is going to be about CEO executive options and the timing of them. So the paper is right on schedule, CEO Option Grants and Opportunism by Robert Daines, Grant McQueen, and Robert Schonlau. And if I mangled any of those names, I apologize. This was published in Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis in 2018. So it's a published paper this time, not a working paper. And if you are not aware, JFQA, which is the acronym for that journal, that's considered right underneath the top three. So we have three top journals, and then this one is basically the fourth place journal, maybe tied for fourth or fourth place by itself, depending on who you talk to. So a pretty good journal to have this published in. And they draw heavily on a number of influential papers that one of my advisors, Eric Lee, authored. So I'll talk a little bit about him and his papers as well as we get into this. So for CEO pay, if you are the CEO of a publicly traded company, especially large ones, the famous ones that everyone knows about, you are paid mostly in equity. So it's either in stock or, for what we're interested in, options to purchase stock instead of being paid in cash. So if you see a news story about a CEO and he earned $50 million or some huge number, you should know that almost all of that amount is coming from the shares of stock or the options that the CEO received for that year. And the reason it was so much money wasn't because they were paying him tons of money, is because the share price went up a lot this year, and so those shares became really valuable. Now, the reason we do this is to try and align the incentives of the CEO with the shareholders. Because if the CEOs are paid in equity, then their financial incentive is the same as the shareholders because they are the shareholders, or they're one of the many shareholders. And so if they increase the stock price, which is what the shareholders want the CEO to be doing, instead of increasing CEO personal gain, well, the CEO will personally gain because the CEO is now being paid in stock. It's a very elegant way to try and solve this agency conflict. Extremely common way to try and solve it. Far from the only way, but pretty much every company will pay mostly in equity for their top executives. Especially, again, the really large publicly traded companies. Now, for the executive options, these are call options. They give the CEO the right to purchase additional shares from the company at a fixed price, the strike price. And options are typically always granted with a strike price equal to the current market price of a share of stock the day that they were granted to the executive. And so then if the future price is higher than the strike price, the CEO will gain additional money from that difference. If we get a $50 per share strike price, the price goes up to $100, the CEO gets an extra $50 of income from each option. They buy at 50, they sell at 100. So if you're the CEO, you like to see a low strike price relative to what the price will be a couple of years from now, because it's going to make your income higher. All right, so now we get to the option backdating. So there was a series of papers by Eric Lee in 2005, and then Heron and Lee in 2007, 2009. Some other people have worked in here too, but Eric Lee was one of my advisors, so I'll talk about him mostly. And they found that companies were not being very honest about the timing of when they granted the stock options. They were consistently granting options on the exact day where the stock price was the lowest out of the entire couple of months or entire year that they had to do an option grant. This is very implausible that so many companies would get so lucky for so many years in a row. But it's very easy to do if you are looking back at the last few months and you just pick out the best day for the CEO and the other executives. With hindsight, it's really easy to pick the lowest stock price. When you're forward looking, it's a lot harder. So they're effectively backdating. They decide to give the option grant maybe in December, And they look back the last couple of months and say, well, the lowest day for stock price was October 2nd. So we're going to make that day the day we claim to have granted the options, even though we're actually granting the options a couple of months later. So this was a big scandal, and there was a lot of media attention. There was quite a number of lawsuits. Eric Lee was an expert witness in several of them. You can find some news articles about that too. And companies were basically forced or voluntarily switched their option grants so that they scheduled the grant ahead of time instead of backdating. Okay, so problem is solved. Companies are no longer able to manipulate the option grants because they can't backdate anymore. They have to fix the date well in advance, so they can't give executives more pay without the shareholders noticing. Well, except, the prices on those scheduled option grant days are still kind of low, maybe lower than we'd expect through random noise. And the authors of this paper, that's what they are looking at. And there's kind of a suspicious timing here. So they look at the cumulative abnormal returns, CARs, and this is the return for the stock price of the company after we filter out the overall market movement. So it's just the stock itself, not stuff going on in the overall market moving the stock. And they are consistently hitting their lowest point within the basically an 8-month window, almost an entire year, right when the options are being granted. Now, they're not backdating. They are granting the options and they're reporting the grant immediately, the very same day or one day later. So it can't be the case that they're doing backdating, but this pattern is not very plausible unless something else is going on to manipulate the stock price, because this shouldn't be happening just by pure chance for so many companies. Well, there's a couple of things that they're testing here. So one is CEOs that have a larger number of options being granted. If the price is manipulated lower, they get more money. So they have a stronger incentive to try and do this if they have a larger grant. And another thing that they are going to be working with is that if a company is difficult for the market to value, and they measure it with idiosyncratic volatility, which is something I've done in my own papers, and there's a lot of other measures as well that people have come up with to try and say, well, this company's hard to value. If it has a lot of R&D expense versus CapEx expense, and there's a number of other measures that you can look up in various academic papers. But they use idiosyncratic volatility. And if it's hard to value, then there's greater potential for management to have the ability to manipulate the price, because the market doesn't know as much about the company, and so the private information that management always is going to have more value in terms of moving stock price. So it's easier to manipulate if it's hard to value. Is the two things. So they have a stronger incentive and it's easier for them to do it. So if you combine both types, you would expect more manipulation. And if we go back to the graph, this dashed line here, that's when it's hard to value and they have a lot of options being granted. We have the lowest point here. The solid line, this is firms being granted, or that are granting high numbers of options. Again, there's a stronger incentive. And then the plus signs here, these are firms with a small grant relative to other firms. And there's some trend down, but it's not a clear U or V kind of shape right at the 0 point. And the effect is quite a bit smaller. So that sort of confirms the hypothesis there that it's going to be stronger for large option grants. It's going to be stronger for companies that are hard to value. But of course, we want to test this for statistical significance. So they run a bunch of regressions. So they have what they call event windows, and they're taking what's the CAR, cumulative abnormal return, from minus 120 days So if we assume 30 days a month, it's going to be 4 months up to the day of the option grant, or 3 months, 2 months, 1 month, or the days after. And then either it's a low number of options, it's a high number of options, it's not hard to value, it is hard to value, it's combined. What they find is very consistently there's a negative return, abnormal return, in the event windows before the option grant. And when we expect the manipulation to be strongest, they have a positive return after the grant. So the stock price goes down right before the grant and then it starts coming back up. This panel B is them looking at only 30 days at a time. In panel C, they're doing comparisons of before and after. So they have car after versus car before. But they're seeing that what the graph is telling us. This is just sort of us in a table doing what that graph was showing us. So when CEOs have a high number of options, or when the company is hard to value, the results are much stronger and clearer. And it appears as though that there's a lot more of the pushing the price down before the grant versus pulling the price back up after the grant is complete. But there is apparently some of that as well. And keep in mind, if you're artificially pushing the price back down, eventually the market will figure it out, especially once you stop pushing, and the market price will kind of revert back to its mean. So there's not necessarily manipulation on the back end, although there probably is, because it could just be like, well, what they were doing to try and push the price down, they stopped doing it, and then the price kind of just naturally drifts higher than it would normally, because now there's no longer this artificial pressure pushing it down. Okay, so let's say you are the CEO and you want to manipulate the stock price. How could you do it? What would you be able to do to actually change the stock price to make it lower temporarily on that day when the options are granted? Well, there's actually a couple of different things you could do. One is to change the information environment. So you either release bad information earlier, so it would have normally come after the option grant, you push it forward and you do it before the option grant. And of course, bad news, assuming it's novel and a surprise to the market price should go down. And the paper calls it bullet dodging. I don't quite get that, because they're not really dodging the bad information. They're sort of pushing the bad information earlier, so they're taking the bullet early because they want to push the price down temporarily. But that's what the paper calls it. Or you can delay good information that would have been released before the option grant until after the option grant. They call it spring loading. So either way, you're either pushing more bad information early or you're pushing good information until later. And that's going to push the stock price down earlier, and it's going to pull the stock price up after the option grant. And management has the potential to do things like this. They have information about investments, how the company's doing, and there's ways that they could talk up their company or talk down their company, or just allow a negative report to come out sooner. They can just tell their staff, all right, get this thing out. We need to get this out ASAP, and they get it out ASAP, or we can wait an extra week until we put out this report. Another possibility is they're manipulating the earnings of the company before the option grant, and then to reduce it, and then they're increasing it afterwards. And there's a lot of research that's been done on earnings management. Probably many companies are doing this, and it's because accounting, well, there's a lot of definitions you have to decide on does this count as an expense? This does not count as an expense. When do I count it as an expense? Is it during this quarter or is it during next quarter? And so managing your accruals, how much expenses and revenue are accruing within a quarter, you can shift some of your revenue and expenses between quarters. And there's a lot of people looking at, like, are companies manipulating their earnings to try and make sure they beat the market expectations or things like that. But here, they would be basically trying to not meet the market expectation. They try to shift expenses earlier, shift revenue later, and they have bad earnings. Option grant happens with low stock price, and then next quarter, their earnings are better because they've sort of shifted all the bad stuff earlier, and they've shifted some good. They pulled some good stuff from earlier in time to this later quarter. Another possibility is that they could be changing their actual investments. They could be changing the timing of their real investments, not just making an accounting definition change. And that'd be even more impactful on the company if they're actually doing it, although that's a much more extreme action. So changing the information they release, messing around with their earnings, changing their actual investment projects. Those are all possible ways they could be doing it. And at the end, we'll do some tests. They do some tests to see which one might be causing this. And I'd like to, just before we get into some of the data and results, point out, we had a kind of a bad unintended consequence here. My advisor, Eric Lee, and other people who had documented this backdating scandal, in order to try and prevent the companies giving extra money to their CEOs, you force them to schedule the grants, but there's none. The CEOs are still able to manipulate the price and get extra pay, but now they're manipulating the stock price. So they're affecting everyone who participates in the market, whereas before they were just, the company was just sort of handing the CEO a little bit of extra money, and the stock price was not affected by this. So not only are we still having the CEO are getting a sneaky amount of extra pay, but the market itself market efficiency is being affected by it. And also, I just want a fun side note, like Eric Lee, it's pronounced Lee, but he found that the companies were lying, and his last name is spelled the same as the word lie. Funny thing there. All right, so in terms of the data that these guys are using, they use a lot of kind of standard data sets. So CRSP for stock price, IBIS for analysts, and the expected earnings that are going to be compared with the actual earnings from CompuStat with the accounting data. There's earnings guidance from management called First Call CIG, SEC Edgar for a lot of filings, including the option grants that are happening. Those go under the 8Ks. SDC if there's any mergers going on, and Thomson Reuters insider filings. They have purchases of company stock by executives, so insider trading, and then if there's a large institutional investor from the 13F filings. I've used a number of these databases. I have not used a few of these databases, but there's nothing super unusual about the data they're doing. It's just what they're finding is very interesting, and well, it published in a very good journal, so and there are a lot of people who agreed with me. Okay, so their multivariate test is that, well, there's a lot of company characteristics that are connected to corporate governance. And these things could be affecting manipulation, as well as the number of option grants and if it's a hard to value fund. So they run a more complicated regression on what they call the round trip CAR. This is, you take the CAR post the option grant, you subtract out the CAR pre-grant, and that gets you the net amount of manipulation going on. Remember, the post-grant, we're going to have CAR going up. Pre-grant, the CAR is going down, so it's going to be a positive number minus a negative number, so it's going to be a positive plus a positive. So they, as sort of controls, they have the percentage of insiders on the board of directors. Typically, insiders tend to be kind of favorable to the CEO. They were often hired by the CEO and currently work with them. So if you have more insiders, typically that's considered to have worse corporate governance. Number of analysts following the company, the more attention the company is getting, the more closely the behavior of the executives is being monitored. Same thing with company size. If it's a large company, it's going to be followed more closely by everyone. And perhaps that prevents this manipulation. The existence of an institutional investor, someone who has a lot of resources to do monitoring, owning a very large percentage of the company. They have a lot of wealth at stake, so they're going to care about preventing agency conflicts, and they have the resources to actually very carefully monitor what the CEO is doing. CEO tenure as CEO, so the longer someone is a CEO, typically the more power that CEO has over the operations of the company. And it's sort of a soft power thing. Like, if you've been CEO for 15 years, you've probably hired all of your C-suite executives who are working directly underneath you. You've probably personally appointed the insider directors, assuming they're not even executives. And even if you didn't hire them directly, you've worked with this person for 15 years. So you're kind of friendly with them, probably. And if there's independent directors, well, they've probably been on the board for a while. And so you've been interacting with them. You become friends with them. You have social connections with that person now. And we had a bunch of papers in the previous semester back in the spring about social connections. So if the CEO has a long time has been at the company for a long time, CEO is going to be more powerful. It's going to be worse in terms of corporate governance. CEO ownership of the company. So if the CEO owns more of the company, the CEO was going to have a stronger incentive to work with the shareholders because the CEO has more wealth at stake. Okay, so those are all sort of the corporate governance measures they include, and none of them matter. So I kind of wasted my time there, didn't I? All of these control variables here, nothing is really showing up. They're not affecting manipulation at all. Number of options, hard to value, yes, those are showing up. Or if the CEO is getting options at all, but these other things don't seem to matter. And the authors basically take that 3% abnormal return right here. It's ranging between 2 and 3%. And when they do sort of the back of the envelope calculation here, we have 300,000 options. The mean share price is about 33. There's a 3% gain because you're getting a lower share price. And it ends up getting the CEO's about a $300,000 immediate gain from the artificially lower share price. Now, the way the option grants are structured, you don't get to exercise the option right away. You have to wait several years at least, often more than just several years. So if you do a time value of money calculation and discount back because the CEO doesn't get to exercise the option and get that $300,000 until 5 years from now or something, the actual immediate gain is more like $100,000. But it's still a non-trivial amount for a CEO. And certainly it's a non-trivial amount for everyone else. Okay, so they did a few additional robustness tests. The first thing they're ruling out is what they call a mechanical effect. So let's say we have a company and they increase the amount granted, the number of options, and it goes from like 100,000 to 110,000 if the stock price drops, because they want to keep the dollar amount they're paying the CEO the same. We're like, okay, we're going to grant you $400,000 in options, and just because it happens to go lower, by pure chance, of course, we are going to give you more options to make up the difference. So if a price drop happens, then the company's going to grant more mechanically. They have to, because they want to keep the dollar amount fixed. So that would make it look like when stock price drop happens, it's causing when there's a larger grant, it's causing the stock price to go down, but instead the price drop is causing the larger grant. So it's a causality. Which one is causing the other? So they try to address this by limiting it to only companies that are having large grants, but it's less than or equal to the previous year grant. So they're not pushing grant size up this year, which I'm not 100% certain it really rules this out, but maybe it does. They also only look at post-grant CARs. And the mechanical effect should be just affecting the price drop before the grant. It wouldn't have anything to do with us having a big increase in price changes after the grant. And I also kind of want to point out, I don't think the authors actually mentioned this, but if I'm the CEO and I know that my company does a fixed dollar amount grant, I have a even stronger incentive to push the price drop down, because now I get more options at that better price. I get 110 options at the lower price versus 100,000 options in the lower price. There's a small penalty if the option amount is fixed, where I got a lower price, but my options are not worth as much. I don't get as much of a cash value when that price is lower. Meanwhile, if I push the price lower and they top me up, I'm getting even more money. So I've highlighted the 3 results they run. So the first one is number of grant options that are less than or equal to the prior year's options. So they have a high number of options being granted, but it's not an increase from the previous year. And then scheduled grants both after and before. And they're still seeing the increase afterwards. And it's pretty much the same magnitude effect as the decrease before the grant. So, every test they run here is working out just fine, and that is their answer for that mechanical effect. Next one is about earnings announcements. So many companies put option grants on the same weekday as their earnings announcement for that quarter. So maybe what's actually happening is that they're manipulating their earnings because they want to control their earnings, and it's not because of option grants. Well, this one's pretty easy to check. There's a bunch of option grants that are happening that are not at the same time as earnings. So you can look at those and say, well, are they manipulating here? If they are, then it's not because of earnings, because there's no earnings going on. Or you look at you look at earnings announcements that are happening on days when there's no option grant. So like 180 days after. So if you have an option grant, you have an earnings announcement, 6 months later, you're going to have another earnings announcement for your next quarter. Well, 2 quarters actually. And there's not going to be an option grant because option grants are usually annual. And so if you find manipulation there, well, then at that point it turns earnings. If you don't find manipulation, well, maybe it's because of the options instead. And also, a lot of the previous work on earnings management, which, again, there's a lot of that, they find that there's continued negative returns after a bad earnings report. But for these guys, if you have an option grant, you're finding positive returns after the earnings announcement. So they find results that are not consistent with what previous people have been finding, if it's really being driven by earnings announcements. So number 5, the grant date is not near earnings announcement. They're seeing a big effect on the net CAR, positive as expected. And if it's 6 months after the scheduled grant date, so it's another earnings announcement, but there's no grant, nothing's happening. Okay, so not earnings announcement, it's the grant itself. And then the last one they do, which they're pretty dismissive of in the paper itself, I suspect that a referee asked for this, and because I doubt they would have included this themselves. I mean, possibly someone else, someone like at a conference, asked them about it, and if someone asks you about this, kind of a robustness check like that at a conference, you probably want to include it in the paper, especially if it's someone important. They have lots of acknowledgments, including one for Eric Lee in their paper here. But I imagine this was not included de novo, like someone brought this up to them. But optimal contracting. So let's say our option grant is better aligning CEO incentive. That's a good thing. We're getting better corporate governance, reducing agency conflict. Then the stock price performs worse because incentives are out of alignment, and they perform better after the option grant because incentives are in alignment. The problem, well, there's a couple of problems. One, the problem which the authors bring up is, why is the market not only giving you penalties for the last couple of months before the option grant. Shouldn't they be giving you penalties, before then? So why are we seeing cars only negative like right before? Also, markets are forward looking. They can read the company's calendar just as well as the CEO can. They can see the option grant is coming up. So they're going to price in that the incentives have been properly aligned again. So that you shouldn't see a decline in market price leading up to this grant. If there's some sort of reaction to this grant because of corporate governance, it's when you announce the grant, the scheduled date for the grant itself, and then the market goes, okay, you're fixing the alignment, great, stock price will go up. So you wouldn't have an increase in price on the grant day because that's not a surprise to the market. The market knows what's going to happen. Now, if it was an unscheduled grant, perhaps, but for scheduled grants, no. So what they look at is grants that are unscheduled because, again, they should be reducing agency conflict under this optimal contracting theory, but it's only the scheduled grants that this executives would be able to manipulate. If it's unscheduled, you don't know when it's going to happen, and you can't strategically release information in the 2 months leading up to the unscheduled grant because you don't know the unscheduled grant is happening. And also they look at what happens before the new regulatory rules very strongly encouraged scheduling grants because the agency benefits should apply throughout the time. It doesn't matter that you're scheduling or not. And what they kind of find is for unscheduled grants, nothing is going on, which is kind of what we would hope if those are not being manipulated. And then if they look at scheduled grants before the regulatory changes that encourage using scheduled grants, and they're not really doing manipulation here. Probably if they are doing manipulation, they're doing backdating because they're allowed to do backdating in this time period, as far as I can remember. So, no. And I mean, the authors themselves didn't seem to think this was a very serious theory. I didn't think it was very serious either for a different reason. And then I don't have any more of these because a lot of these are just, we just change our sample a little bit. We have some limitations of stock price or limitations on what kind of firms or, guaranteeing that the stock strike price is identical to the market price. But they do also look at if the CFO or other directors or officers are also receiving grants that same week, same day. And the effects are stronger. Makes a lot of sense. Those guys also have some influence over releasing information strategically, things like that. And so if they're going to benefit from this manipulation too, they're not going to try and stop the CEO from benefiting them. And they might actually be doing this independently, the CEO, to try to benefit themselves too. I mean, their grants are going to be smaller, but also the amount of money they get annually is smaller too. So I thought that was a nice confirmation. And the rest of it was kind of, I ignored most of the rest of the robustness. Okay, last thing to cover is the manipulation method. If companies are manipulating, and we think they are, how did they do it? How were they reducing the price before the grant? How are they increasing the price after the grant? Well, the first thing to look at is the information. So was there information releases going on before and after? So there's lots of information being released before and after. Probably that's a way they can use that's an obvious way they can use to manipulate it. And so they look at 8K filings. Those are information updates. Option grants are one of them, but there's a ton of things that can fall under 8Ks. And for the high option and hard to value ones, yep, they have an increase here. It's quite strong statistically, comparing before and after. They also look at if it's around the earnings announcement because there may be affecting their earnings announcements. Not quite as strong statistically, but again, it's there for high numbers of options, hard to value firms. They're getting more car when it's an earnings announcement day. They also look at managerial guidance. And the interesting thing about managerial guidance is this is basically optional for the company. They don't have to release it if they don't want to. And the company has a lot more control over what they're saying in the earnings guidance. So it's statistically not as strong as like the 8K filings, but the magnitude is quite powerful. And it's also like statistically quite strong when you're not focusing on the hard to value companies. Potentially the market doesn't trust the guidance as much for the hard to value companies because they know it's hard to value. Like, what are you don't know what the earnings are going to be, Mr. CEO, next year. Like, no one knows. So it's possible that it values less. Although, again, keep in mind, there's not as many, nearly as many companies in this sample here. It drops down a lot. But there's definitely evidence for things going on with earning guidance, 8K filings, earning announcements. So yes, information channel looks like it's a strong candidate. And then they also look at a few of the other things. So if there's more earnings management accruals. Yes. So again, we knew earnings management was there before. Accruals is the most likely channel for it, and no surprise, it actually is showing up here. These differences here are the actual CAR versus a pseudo placebo CAR. Earnings guidance, again, that's showing up. Earnings surprises, showing up quite strongly. Real earnings management, this is if they're changing their investment. This one doesn't show up. And then 8K information, again, that's showing up. So it's mostly not coming from real investments. They're not changing their real investments, thankfully. That's probably the most extreme action they could have done. But information, they're changing the information probably. They're also manipulating earnings. And panel A is the high number of options, hard to value. So this is where it should be strongest. And if you look at the low number of options, it's not hard to value firm. You're not seeing much of anything going on. All right, so just to wrap up our paper here, companies are still trying to give CEOs more money. They just found a new way to get around the regulatory change. In fact, the regulatory change made it so, caused them to manipulate it in this new way. And it's, as I said earlier, like it's in some ways worse because instead of just manipulating the day that they pick to grant the options, they're manipulating the actual market price on that day, on a fixed day. And I talked to Eric Lee about this, or he talked to us in our PhD class. And one thing he said about this whole backdating thing and this manipulation of option grants is when they were doing the backdating, it wasn't technically illegal. They had significant amount of time where they could just wait before they announced that they did the option grant. So they had the ability to do the backdating if they wanted to, but they were hiding it. And the reason they were hiding it is because they knew, well, it's unethical, and also they knew the shareholders wouldn't like it. Of course you don't like it. No, you're not going to like it if people try to sneakily give extra money to the CEO. And shareholders have to approve the actual pay package for the CEO himself. So what the authors suggest is sort of as a policy change, as a solution, which, again, this came out in 2018. It was obviously being shopped around at conferences and such because all papers in top journals tend to have that happen to them in probably a year or two before then. So I'm not sure if the accounting rules changed, but one thing you could do is change the accounting rules that basically force companies to grant options on the money at the strike price. And if you did that, then the company could say, well, we're granting you the options on this day, but instead of the strike price being today's market price, we're going to take the average of all trading days. So yeah, you can try to manipulate it every single day in the year, but good luck. So that would be a great way to fix it, but you'd have to change the accounting rules because otherwise they're not going to want to ever grant options not on the money. Or, and this is something that authors propose, is don't grant options all on a single day, because that means you just have to manipulate one day. Instead, grant smaller amounts every month or every week, and you grant them on the money using the market price for that day. But these are much smaller grants. They happen very frequently, so it's much harder to manipulate. And of course, the more frequently you grant the options, the harder it is for the CEO to manipulate them. And I mean, you'd have to think carefully about it and probably just test it and see if there's any more unintended consequences here. Certainly, one problem with very frequent grants is now there's a lot of extra paperwork that the CEOs of companies have to do, because there's a separate option grant every time that you have to track for tax purposes. And if you do it once a year, when you just got to track it once, if you do it every week, you got like 50 you have to track every year, which adds up to be pretty large numbers of things you got to take care of if you're working for the company for several years. And who knows, I mean, companies are the CEOs, companies are very smart people, and if they want more money, they're going to try and look for ways to do it. So if you remove this avenue, they'll go look for another way, and they might find one. Maybe you open a loophole with your new rule about forcing them to do it more frequently, or they just find some unknown way that doesn't work quite as well, but which is why they weren't doing it before, but they still go after it. All right, so that is our paper for this week. An older paper, but it was a really interesting one. I was talking with Eric over the summer about some of these option grant things, and he actually sent me a link to this paper, and I was like, "Ooh, this is a cool paper. I should do it for the fall semester." So that is why I did this one, and we'll be going back to some more working papers from a recent top conference over the summer for most of the rest of this semester. So if you want to see that, you'll have to just keep tuning in each week. And if you enjoyed this paper, please comment, like, and or subscribe so that other people can find it too. I'm sure they would enjoy it as well. I'll see you all next week.